Time travel wasn't supposed to feel this wrong. Jax Arlen had made hundreds of jumps before, each one precise and controlled. His job as a temporal navigator was simple. Slip through the cracks of time, get in, gather the data, and get out. No interaction, no disruptions. Follow the rules, and the timeline stays intact. But this time, the jump fell off the moment he hit the ground. The sky wasn't right. It was a dull shade of orange. Like a dying sun was trapped behind endless clouds. Jax looked around, expecting to see the towering skyline of New Chicago, year 2342, but instead, there was nothing. No buildings, no people. Just an empty, endless desert stretching out in all directions. "This isn't New Chicago," Jax muttered, scanning the horizon for any sign of life. His wrist device, designed to give him precise temporal coordinates, flashed an error. No signal. Panic crept up his spine, but he pushed it down. Time travel glitches happened, rarely, but they happened. The procedure was simple. Recalibrate, jump back, fix the glitch, and return to the mission. But as Jax tried to key in the recalibration sequence, the device beeped again. Error. His jump back was blocked. "Ava," Jax said into his comm, hoping his partner could hear him through the static. "Ava, do you copy? I'm getting some kind of glitch here. Nothing's making sense. This isn't where we were supposed to land." The comm crackled. Then her voice broke through. "Jax, I'm losing your signal. Are you in New Chicago?" Jax turned in a slow circle, taking in the desolate, alien landscape. "No, there's nothing here. Ava, it's just sand. The city's gone." Static swallowed her response. His pulse quickened as he looked down at his wrist device, tapping it again. The readout was wrong, glitching with symbols and dates that didn't belong. New Chicago, 342 was gone. According to the device, it had never even existed. A chill ran through him. The glitch wasn't just a small temporal anomaly. It was something bigger, something far worse. Suddenly, the ground beneath Jax trembled. He staggered, eyes widening as a massive crack snaked its way through the desert floor, heading straight for him. He leapt back just as the ground split open, revealing something metallic, a massive structure buried beneath the surface. Jax froze, staring down into the fissure. This wasn't supposed to be here. No records mentioned anything like this under New Chicago, let alone in the year 2342. The structure was huge, ancient-looking, and completely alien. His comm crackled again. "Jax, what's going on?" "You need to get out of there now." "I can't," Jax replied, his heart racing. "There's something here. Something big. I think it's been here for a long time." Before Eva could respond, a low, rumbling sound came from deep within the structure. Jax backed away from the fissure as something stirred inside the dark abyss. His wrist device began flashing wildly, warnings and errors flooding the screen. The glitch wasn't just affecting the surface. It was spreading through time, warping reality itself. Then, from the depths of the fissure, a figure emerged. It wasn't human. Its form shimmered like it was caught between dimensions, flickering in and out of existence. The air around it warped and twisted, distorting reality. Jax took another step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, locked onto Jax. Its voice echoed in his mind, not through his ears, but like a memory forced into his brain. "You weren't supposed to be here." Jax's mouth went dry. "Neither were you." The figure stepped closer, its form shifting like liquid. "You broke the rules. You caused the glitch." Jax shook his head. "No, I followed the protocol. This isn't my fault." The figure tilted its head, considering him. "You didn't do this. Yet, what does that even mean?" Jax demanded, feeling the weight of something much bigger than a simple glitch pressing down on him. The figure pointed to the massive structure below.
"That is where it begins?"
"You must fix it, or the timeline collapses." Jax's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the impossible. The glitch had started before he even arrived, but the figure was telling him he was responsible. If he didn't fix it, time itself could unravel. "How do I fix it?" Jax asked, his voice tight with urgency. The figure's form flickered, its edges blurring. You have to go back. To the beginning. Before the glitch. Before Jax could respond, the ground beneath him rumbled again, the fissure widened, and the ancient structure below began to shift, rising toward the surface as if it were alive. Jax's comm sparked to life again. Ava's voice panicked.
Jax.
Get out of there! The timeline is collapsing. The portal is destabilizing, but there was no way out. Not yet. Jax took a deep breath, staring into the heart of the impossible. He didn't know what had caused the glitch, but one thing was clear. It was bigger than him, bigger than anything he had been trained for, and if he didn't stop it, everything, everywhere would fall apart.
Hold on.
Eva, Jax said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. I think I just found out how we broke time. And with that, he stepped into the dark. Shifting structure. Jax descended into the dark, his heartbeat echoing in his ears as he made his way through the jagged, metallic walls of the buried structure. The air felt thicker here, heavy with the weight of centuries. His wrist device flickered erratically, failing to provide any useful readings. Whatever this place was, it didn't belong in the timeline. He reached a wide, open chamber that stretched impossibly far in every direction. The walls were smooth, curved, and alive with a strange pulsing energy. Symbols, not unlike the glitching patterns on his device, blinked in and out of existence on the surface, as though reality itself couldn't decide what this place should be. Jax had seen temporal distortions before, but nothing like this. This is where it begins. The voice echoed again, though the figure was nowhere to be seen. It was like the structure itself was speaking to him now. Jax clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. What is this place? How did it get here? The voice responded, though its tone felt more distant. It was built by those who tried to control time itself. They failed. Jax turned, his eyes searching the shadows of the chamber. Who are you? And why am I seeing this now? There was a long silence before the voice returned. I am what remains of them. And you are the reason it all went wrong. Jax's chest tightened. The weight of the accusation felt like a punch to the gut. He had followed every rule, obeyed every protocol. He wasn't reckless. He had been careful. But if the voice was right, if he had broken time itself, then the consequences would be far worse than anything he could have imagined. Then tell me how to fix it, Jax demanded. His voice echoed through the vast chamber, but it sounded small in the overwhelming space. Suddenly, the walls around him began to shift. The glowing symbols moved, reshaping themselves into new forms, like a code he couldn't decipher. Jax watched as the floor beneath his feet started to pulse, vibrating with a low hum that grew louder by the second. The structure was coming alive. Fix it? You cannot undo what has already been set in motion, the voice whispered. Barely audible, but you can stop what is yet to come. The symbols on the walls shifted again, revealing a new pathway that led deeper into the structure. The air in the chamber became colder, sharper, as if it were pulling energy from the surrounding environment. Jax felt the pull, a force drawing him toward the newly revealed corridor. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, but there was no escape now. Not with the timeline crumbling around him. He had to see this through. With his pulse quickening, Jax stepped into the corridor. It was narrow, the walls glowing faintly with that same strange energy. His wrist device continued to glitch, displaying meaningless symbols and flashing warning lights. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if time itself was resisting him. At the end of the corridor, Jax entered a smaller chamber, this one more contained, more focused. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and resting on top of it, pulsing with energy, was a small, translucent orb, the core of the glitch. It was the source of everything that had gone wrong. Jax approached cautiously, feeling the pull of the orb like a gravitational force. It wasn't just an object. It was alive, vibrating with the power to manipulate time. He reached out, but the moment his hand got close, the room darkened, and the walls began to tremble. A shadowy figure appeared in the corner of the chamber, its form flickering like before. But this time, its voice was clearer, sharper. You weren't supposed to touch it, the figure said, its tone accusatory. This is what caused the fracture. Your presence here set the collapse in motion. Jax jerked his hand back, his mind reeling. I didn't know. No one told me this place even existed. The figure's form wavered, and its voice softened. The past has already been broken. But if you touch the core again, you can fix it. Jax looked down at the glowing orb, his thoughts racing. The figure's words hung heavy in the air. The glitch had already begun. But maybe, just maybe, he could reverse it. He could rewrite the timeline, undo whatever he had set in motion. But at what cost? As if sensing his hesitation, the figure spoke again. Touch it, and everything resets. The timeline will stabilize, but you won't remember. The past you know will be erased. Jax's heart pounded in his chest. Reset the timeline? Erase everything? The thought was dizzying, but he couldn't let the collapse continue. If the timeline shattered, it wouldn't just be his world that was affected. It would be every world, every moment in existence. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. And if I don't touch it? The figure flickered, its form growing fainter. Then the collapse continues. Time unravels. Everything falls apart. Jax felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had been trained to avoid interference, to keep time intact at all costs. But this was bigger than any rule, bigger than any mission. His hand hovered over the orb. It pulsed softly, beckoning him to act, to make a choice. And in that moment, Jax realized something. He wasn't just fixing a glitch. He was erasing everything he had ever known. The figure's voice faded into the background as the room grew darker, the timeline destabilizing further with every second. It's your choice. Jax, save the future, or hold on to the past. Jax's hand shook as he lowered it toward the core. Jax's hand hovered over the orb, his mind spinning with the weight of his decision. Time had always felt like something he could navigate, something stable and predictable. But now it was slipping through his fingers, unraveling right in front of him. If he reset the timeline, he'd be sacrificing everything he knew, including himself. He clenched his jaw, staring at the pulsing orb. It was so small, yet it held the power to rewrite entire realities. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. Was he really about to do this? The shadowy figure flickered again, more unstable than before. The longer you wait, the less there is to save. It warned, its voice an echo that seemed to reverberate inside his skull. The collapse is accelerating. If you do nothing, time itself will be lost. Jax swallowed hard. His mind raced with memories of his life, the missions he'd completed, the people he cared about, his partner Eva. All of it would be erased, rewritten as though none of it had ever happened. And yet, what choice did he have? Every second he hesitated brought the universe closer to total collapse. He drew in a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. What happens after I touch it? He asked, his voice low. The figure flickered once more. The timeline will be restored to its original state. You will return to the point before the glitch occurred, but your memories will not. Jax felt his stomach tighten. Everything he knew, everything he had experienced, it would all be gone, wiped clean like it had never existed. He'd be nothing more than a ghost in the timeline, someone who had existed only in fractured moments, but there was no other way. He had to act. If he didn't, the collapse would continue, and the entire universe would crumble into chaos. With one last deep breath, Jax lowered his hand onto the glowing orb. The moment his fingers touched its surface, the world around him exploded with light. A violent surge of energy shot through his body, knocking him back as the timeline began to reset. The chamber disappeared, replaced by a swirling vortex of colors and shapes, all colliding and twisting in ways that defied reality. Jax felt himself being pulled through time, through moments, places, people, everything at once. His memories unraveled, faces blurred. Events flickered like static on a broken screen. He tried to hold on to something, anything, but it was useless. The timeline was being rewritten, and he was being erased along with it. The pain was unbearable, a deep, ripping sensation that tore through his very being. But as the reset progressed, the pain began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. The universe was correcting itself. The glitch was being undone, and so was Jax. When Jax opened his eyes, He found himself standing in the middle of a bustling city street. The sun was shining overhead, casting long shadows over the sleek, metallic buildings that lined the street. People hurried by, their faces a blur of activity. Hover cars zipped through the air, their engines humming softly. Jax blinked, disoriented. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, trying to make sense of where he was. It felt familiar, but at the same time, completely foreign. He glanced down at his wrist device. The date read, New Chicago, 2342. Everything was exactly as it should be, but something was wrong. He couldn't remember how he got here. He couldn't remember why he was here. His head ached, and there was an unsettling emptiness inside him, like something important had been taken away. Jax pressed a button on his comm device. Eva, do you copy? He asked, hoping to hear her voice. The device beeped, but there was no response. He tried again. Eva? Are you there? Still nothing. Panic gripped him. Why wasn't she answering? Where was she? He didn't even remember the mission they were on, or how long they'd been apart. It was as though his mind had been wiped clean. Jax looked around, trying to steady himself. The world seemed normal. People moved through the city like nothing had happened. The timeline had been restored, but something inside him knew the truth. He wasn't the same person he had been before the reset. Everything he had once known, everything he had fought for was gone. As he stood in the middle of the street, trying to piece together the fragments of his broken memory, a hand touched his shoulder. Jack spun around to see a woman standing behind him, her expression calm but focused. She was tall, with short black hair and piercing eyes that seemed to look right through him. Her uniform was familiar, but he couldn't place it. You don't remember me, do you? She asked softly. Jack shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. Should I? The woman smiled faintly, though there was sadness in her eyes. You did something brave, she said. Something that no one else could have done. But it cost you everything. Jack stared at her, confused and frustrated. Who are you? The woman hesitated for a moment, then sighed. I'm someone who knew you before. Someone who watched you save the timeline, even though you knew you'd lose yourself in the process. Jax's chest tightened. I don't understand. She looked away for a moment, then met his gaze again. You were part of something bigger than you ever realized. Jax. And now, you're starting over. Jax took a shaky breath. I don't know who I am anymore. The woman's hand tightened on his shoulder. But you will. You'll find your way again. As she turned to leave, Jax felt the weight of the truth settle over him. He had saved the universe from total collapse. But in doing so, he had erased everything that made him who he was. He was a stranger in his own life now, wandering through a world he no longer recognized. But somewhere, deep down, he knew he had made the right choice. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to rebuild what he had lost. Jax watched the woman disappear into the crowd, her words lingering in his mind like an unfinished puzzle. The city around him felt surreal, vibrant with life but detached from him in every way. The timeline had been restored, but he felt like an outsider in a world that no longer knew him. And worse, that he no longer understood. His wrist device beeped softly, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced down. A message flickered on the screen. Unknown signal detected. Location Sector 9. Jax frowned. Sector 9 was an industrial district in New Chicago, a place where nothing of interest should have been happening, but the message pulsed on his screen like a heartbeat, pulling him toward it. With nothing else to go on and the strange emptiness inside him growing unbearable, Jax followed the signal. The streets grew quieter as he neared Sector 9. The gleaming towers of the city center gave way to rundown buildings and old factories. It was a stark contrast to the bustling heart of New Chicago, almost forgotten by time itself. Faded signs, rusted metal, and broken-down hover cars lined the narrow streets. The signal on Jax's device grew stronger with every step. He stopped in front of an abandoned warehouse, its massive steel doors rusted shut. The signal was coming from inside. Jax hesitated for a moment, his mind flashing with a sense of déjà vu. He couldn't place it, but something about this place felt familiar. It stirred a feeling deep inside him, a memory long buried by the reset. He took a deep breath, pushed the doors open, and stepped inside. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust. Shafts of light from the broken ceiling illuminated patches of the floor, casting long shadows over the empty space. Jax's footsteps echoed as he moved deeper into the warehouse, his wrist device beeping louder. At the far end of the room, something glowed faintly in the shadows. Jax moved closer, his heart racing. As he reached the source of the light, he saw it, another temporal device, just like the one he wore on his wrist. It was embedded in the floor, half buried in debris, but its energy core pulsed weakly, still active despite the years of neglect. He knelt down and carefully picked up the device, turning it over in his hands. The design was older, more primitive than his own, but it was unmistakably a time travel tool, and it was sending out the signal that had led him here. But why? And who had left it behind? A sudden movement behind him made Jax freeze. He spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm he no longer carried. His eyes searched the shadows, heart pounding. Someone or something was here with him. "Who's there?" Jax called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. A figure stepped out from the darkness. Jax's breath caught in his throat. It was the woman from earlier, the one who had spoken to him in the street. She walked toward him slowly, her eyes locked onto his, but something was different now. Her face was set with determination, and in her hand, she held a device identical to the one he had just found. "You weren't supposed to find this," she said, her voice low but steady. Jax's mind raced. "What is this? Why did it lead me here?" The woman sighed and walked closer until she stood just a few feet from him. "This was your backup plan. You set this up before the reset. Before you lost everything." Jax's heart skipped a beat. "I did this? Why?" "Because you knew the reset would erase everything," the woman explained. "You knew you'd forget who you were. So, you left yourself a way to remember." Jax stared at her, his mind spinning. He had planned for this? He had known the cost of resetting the timeline and still done it. Then why don't I remember? The woman smiled sadly. "Because you weren't meant to. This device," she gestured to the one in his hand, "was meant to trigger your memories when the time was right. But the reset, it was more powerful than either of us expected. It took more than we thought." Jax's chest tightened. The weight of the truth crashed over him. He had been prepared to sacrifice everything, even his own memories, to save the timeline. But now he was standing in the ruins of his own life, not knowing who he had once been or why he had done it. "But why you?" Jax asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you remember me when I don't?" The woman hesitated, her eyes softening. "Because you asked me to." Jax blinked, confused. "What?" She stepped closer, her voice gentler now. "Before the reset, you told me to stay close. You knew I'd be able to help you remember when the time was right. I was your anchor, your last connection to the person you used to be." Jax's heart pounded as he tried to make sense of it all. "And now what? What am I supposed to do?" The woman looked at him with a mix of hope and sadness. "That's up to you. You can walk away from all of this, leave the timeline stable, and live a life without the burden of knowing. Or, you can try to rebuild what you lost. You can reclaim who you were." Jax swallowed hard. The weight of her words pressed down on him. He had sacrificed his memories, his past, his entire identity to save the universe from collapse. But now he had a choice. He could leave it all behind, live out the rest of his life in peace. Or he could fight to remember, to reclaim the person he had once been, no matter the cost. The woman reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you choose, Jax, you don't have to do it alone." Jax looked into her eyes, searching for answers he didn't even know how to ask. Slowly, he nodded. "I need to know who I was," he said, his voice firm. "I need to remember." The woman smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Then let's get started." Jax took a deep breath and looked down at the temporal device in his hand, the weight of the future and the past bearing down on him. This was just the beginning.